In July of 1518, in the imperial city of Strasbourg, a woman stepped into the street and began to dance. There was no music, no celebration, no festival to explain it. She moved for hours, through the heat of the day, through the darkness of the night, and when morning came, she was still moving. Her name, preserved in municipal records, was Frau Troffea. At first, neighbors assumed distress, perhaps illness, perhaps a private grief made visible, but she did not stop. By the third day, her body continued in restless motion, and a small crowd had gathered to watch. Within a week, others joined her, not in harmony, not in joy, but in repetition. Isolated individuals began to move in the same relentless rhythm, as if compelled by something beyond deliberate choice. By late July, dozens were dancing in the streets of Strasbourg. Some collapsed from exhaustion. Contemporary accounts suggest that several died in the weeks that followed, likely from stroke or heart failure brought on by sustained exertion under the summer sun. The precise number remains uncertain. What is certain is that the movement spread. To understand why, one must understand Strasbourg in 1518. It was a free imperial city within the Holy Roman Empire, governed by a city council composed largely of merchants and civic elites. It was not a lawless town, nor an ignorant one. It was a structured society bound by trade networks, guilds, and religious institutions. Yet the early 16th century had been unforgiving. The region had endured years of failed harvests, grain prices rose sharply, famine had pressed against the poor with particular severity, disease circulated through crowded neighborhoods, economic inequality was visible and acute. And beyond material hardship, there was spiritual tension. Europe stood on the brink of the Reformation. Religious anxiety was widespread. Divine judgment was not an abstract concept, but a lived expectation. Illness and disaster were often interpreted as signs of moral imbalance. In this environment, the cult of Saint Vitus held influence. He was believed to possess the power to afflict individuals with uncontrollable movement and to cure them. What later generations would call neurological disorders were then framed in spiritual language. The body was not merely biological, it was theological. When Frau Troffea began to dance, the city did not immediately interpret it as madness. It could be a curse, a sign, a manifestation of divine displeasure. The city council responded as authorities often do in times of uncertainty. They sought expertise. Physicians were consulted. They rejected demonic possession and instead offered a medical explanation. The dancers, they argued, suffered from overheated blood. According to humoral theory, the imbalance required release. Their prescription was continuation. If the afflicted needed to move, then resisting the movement might worsen the condition. The council cleared space in public halls. A wooden platform was constructed. Musicians were hired to maintain rhythm so that the dancers might exhaust the sickness from their bodies. What had begun as private distress became civic policy. Crowds gathered to observe. Some came in fear, others in fascination. The spectacle took on a life of its own. And as the music continued, so did the dancing. As the weeks progressed, the dancing did not subside. Reports from municipal documents indicated that by August, the number of participants had grown significantly. Chroniclers later claimed that as many as several hundred people were affected at the height of the outbreak. Whether that figure is exact remains debated, but the scale was large enough to alarm the authorities. The dancers moved without coordination, without shared choreography. Their motions were repetitive, driven, and sustained far beyond ordinary endurance. Witnesses described blank expressions, distant focus, and apparent inability to respond coherently when addressed. Some were supported by family members to prevent collapse, others fell where they stood. The council's strategy began to falter. The belief that motion would cure motion proved tragically misguided. The heat of the Alsatian summer was unrelenting. Physical limits were tested. Contemporary accounts record deaths attributed to exhaustion and cardiovascular failure, yet precise numbers are impossible to confirm. Burial records do not provide clarity, and chroniclers may have amplified figures to emphasize moral lessons. Eventually, the authorities altered course. If the physician's natural explanation had failed, then perhaps the spiritual interpretation required attention. The dancers were transported to a shrine dedicated to Saint Vitus in the Vosges Mountains. There, priests performed rituals intended to lift the supposed curse. Shoes marked with crosses were placed upon their feet, prayers were offered, fasting and religious observance accompanied the rites. Gradually, the outbreak diminished. By early autumn, the streets of Strasbourg returned to ordinary rhythm. Trade resumed its familiar cadence. The music ceased. But the event did not disappear into silence. It lingered in memory, in written record, in the uneasy awareness that something fragile within society had briefly surfaced. Modern historians have sought explanation through multiple lenses. One hypothesis once suggested ergot poisoning, a fungus infecting rye that can induce convulsions and hallucinations. Yet ergot typically produces symptoms inconsistent with sustained, organized dancing over weeks. Most scholars now regard this theory as unlikely. The prevailing interpretation is mass psychogenic illness, a collective stress response shaped by shared belief and extreme social strain. Strasbourg in 1518 was a community under pressure. Hunger weakens more than the body. It erodes psychological resilience. Economic instability disrupts trust. Religious anxiety heightens suggestibility. In such an environment, behavior can spread through imitation and expectation. When one individual begins to express distress physically, others, primed by cultural narrative, may unconsciously follow. The body becomes the stage upon which collective fear is performed. Authority, in attempting to manage the crisis publicly, may have unintentionally legitimized it. By constructing stages and hiring musicians, the council acknowledged the phenomenon as real and treatable. That acknowledgement gave it structure. Fear, once structured, can propagate. Yet it is important not to reduce the dancers to mere symbols of hysteria. They were individuals living within a worldview fundamentally different from our own. Their experience was interpreted through the language available to them: humoral medicine, saintly intercession, divine warning. The surviving sources are not neutral. Chroniclers often framed events within moral narratives. Numbers may have been adjusted to serve theological or didactic purposes. The absence of precise documentation leaves gaps that cannot be fully closed. What remains is convergence across records. In the summer of 1518, a significant number of Strasbourg citizens danced uncontrollably for days and weeks, and some died as a result. The event challenges modern assumptions. We tend to believe that reason insulates us from collective breakdown, that scientific understanding prevents such episodes. Yet mass psychological phenomena have not vanished from history. They evolve, they take different forms, they adapt to cultural context. The dancing plague endures not because it is sensational, but because it is revealing. It reveals how belief shapes perception, how stress reshapes behavior, how institutions, even when acting rationally within their framework, can misjudge the forces they confront. In the quiet that followed that summer, Strasbourg resumed its order. Markets reopened, councils convened, churches filled as before. But for weeks, the city had witnessed bodies moving beyond apparent control and had responded with music. There is something unsettling in that image, not because it is grotesque, but because it is human. Under sufficient strain, the boundary between mind and body thins. Under sufficient fear, behavior synchronizes. And in moments of crisis, authority may mistake visibility for understanding. The dancers of 1518 left no manifesto, no unified explanation. They left movement, a brief season in which an entire community watched its people turn in relentless rhythm, seeking relief that did not come easily. History often records wars, treaties, and revolutions, but sometimes it records something quieter and more intimate, a society revealing its fractures through the bodies of its own citizens. If enough pressure gathers within a population, where does it go? In Strasbourg, it became motion, and the echo of that motion remains, not as spectacle, but as warning.